Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to the African American Heritage House and the 2021 Assembly. My name is Errol Davis, and I have the distinct honor and privilege of serving as president of the African American Heritage House here at Chautauqua, or AAHH as we fondly refer to it. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 10th and final lecture that the AAHH will sponsor or co-sponsor during this assembly season. We are a diverse support organization which is informed by the African American experience. We are committed to strengthening Chautauqua, and we do this in a variety of ways, by encouraging and certainly welcoming diversity, by fostering honest conversations such as the Mirror Project, and by adding robust new voices to the programmatic mix, one of which you will hear here today. Our focus over the last few years has been primarily on getting the narrative correct. Our view is that we must get the history correct, to get the understandings correct, to get the future relationships correct. It's that simple. It is therefore imperative that we own both our past, a fact-based past, as well as our present. Thus, we are committed to telling the stories that need to be told, primarily from the perspective of historically marginalized people. I encourage all of our viewers to visit our website, aaheritagehouse.org, which is shown on your screen. There you will learn how you can support and even become involved in our work. As we are entirely supported by contributions, I want to thank our many friends and patrons for making possible all that we have been able to do over the last 3 years. Without the generosity of our friends and supporters, their advice and counsel, as well as their financial support, we would be unable to have the kind of impact at Chautauqua that we have had over the years and are doing so yet again this season. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for supporting this work. This week's thematic focus at Chautauqua is on resilience. This, of course, is a topic of great importance to all marginalized people. Perseverance and resilience in the face of not only overt but structural racism in our society has been a constant in the life of the marginalized in America. Today, our speaker is Rev Shantell Hinton Hill, an engineer turned pastor who focuses her work at the intersections of social justice, public theology, and speculative fiction. When she's not building and maintaining deep relationships with community members, Reverend Hill is helping the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation ask deep questions about the realities and new futures that an equitable Arkansas would mean for all of its residents. Currently, Reverend Hill is focused on narrative change and community voice as a means for radical movement building. She is a native of Conway, Arkansas. She is married to Reverend Jeremy Hill. She recently obtained a Master of Divinity from Vanderbilt School of Divinity. She also earned a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from Vanderbilt University, as well as a Master of Science in Electrical Engineering from Colorado State University. She is a proud member of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority, as well as the National Society of Black Engineers. Her vocational experiences are broad. They include work as a process control engineer on one end and a Bible teacher on the other. Most recently, she was assistant university chaplain at Vanderbilt University. She is an ordained minister in the Disciples of Christ Christian Church. In her spare time, Shantell loves coloring, writing, and science fiction. Her favorite quote is, "Do the work your soul must have." This was coined by the late womanist pioneer, Reverend Katie G. Cannon. I am truly honored that she has agreed to share her thoughts with us here today, and I know that you're going to find her remarks both enjoyable as well as enlightening. However, before we begin today's lecture, our audience should know that you may submit questions for our live Q&A with Shantell through the submission portal at questions.chq.org, which is on your screen at the moment. You can do this from any mobile or desktop browser. If you use Twitter, use the hashtag CHQ2021. Today's remarks were pre-recorded. However, they will be followed by a live Q&A with Reverend Hill with questions submitted by our live audience tuning in from around the country and around the world in many instances. I will be assisted in the interview process by my colleague and fellow board member at Chautauqua, Helene Gale. My fellow Chautauquans, the AAHH is pleased to present to you Rev Shantell Hinton Hill.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rev Shantell Hinton Hill, and I am an equity officer at the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, located in Little Rock, Arkansas. Today, I'm going to talk to you about revolutionary resilience, truth-telling for radical futures. Resilience is defined as the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, the ability of a substance or object to spring back into shape. Its adjectives include toughness and elasticity. In light of this definition, resilience has long been touted as one of the most admirable qualities or characteristics any person could exemplify, because it speaks to a grit and determination that is lauded in our society. More specifically, resilience has been cemented into the way we are raised and socialized to understand ourselves as humans, particularly in our American context. The narratives of our past, the hallmarks of our history, are full of stories of resilient folks who had a vision for a better home, better government, better economy, better way of life. And these same resilient folks became the forefathers of everything that is seemingly great about America. Yet the actions of these trailblazers has come at the grave expense of an unquestioned understanding of resilience as a virtue, while excusing the vices that continue to pervade the lived experiences of countless who are and should be recognized as truly human, instead of valorized as heroic for their ability to endure suffering. Take, for instance, the true story of Derlin, who is 90 years old and works 6 shifts a week as a pizza delivery guy so that he can make ends meet during this ongoing global pandemic. He lives in Anytown, USA. He is the neighbor who always waves and walks to church every Sunday. He always has a smile on his face and makes conversation with anyone he comes across, because Derlin doesn't find strangers. Wherever he goes, he makes friends. Because of Derlin's rising popularity, thanks to a well-known TikToker who recorded their interactions every time Derlin delivered them pizza, his local community raised over $12,000 for Derlin, simply because they wanted him to know how awesome he was and that they loved and appreciated him for his hard work. Heartwarming story about a hardworking and resilient old man, isn't it? There's no greater feeling than watching a community of people come together to support someone in need, except the fact that there are millions of other Derlins out there with no community cheering them on from TikTok. In fact, we should all be wondering why it is so heartwarming to bless a man for struggling to survive, and why it is not also just as heart-wrenching that he's even struggling at all. Derlin represents the countless people who are struggling to make ends meet while working 2 or 3 jobs. These folks, our neighbors, friends, family members, and pizza delivery people, are known as ALICE, which stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. Right here in Arkansas, where I currently reside, nearly half of our total population are considered ALICE, meaning they, like Derlin, are stuck working several low-wage jobs in order to sustain themselves or their families. All the while, we are patting them on the back for being essential to our economy and resilient enough to keep our local businesses afloat with their labor. In my line of work as an equity officer at the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, I partner with other funders and field practitioners to design, pilot, and scale both innovation and coordinated action that advances social movements. In simpler terms, I try to use philanthropic dollars and other forms of capital to support people doing justice and equity work. Most recently, I have spent my time building networks of people who care about changing the harmful narratives we all carry about people like Derlin. The narratives that tell us that people enduring financial hardship and suffering are somehow there by their own choices, or that they just need to work harder, get more education, or come from better genetics if they want to make a living wage. Some of the most exciting things I have been able to do to help change the narrative about the resilience of our hardest working residents include working with local funders to create a connective care and action network, which will fund a coalition of 10 community-based and advocacy nonprofits to work on a common vision to bring fairer housing and policy to Arkansas, a state where virtually no habitability laws exist. I've also been able to provide visionary leadership to an inaugural cohort of faith leaders in Arkansas who will engage on a year-long journey of becoming advocates, advancing the moral narrative of economic inclusion, and piloting localized projects within their faith communities to inspire action toward economic equity for those in their proximity. And lastly, in collaboration with subject matter experts in strategic communications and computer technology, I've also been able to dream up a new narrative initiative called Reimagine Arkansas that decenters traditional media outlets and instead focuses on the voices and perspectives of everyday people who just want a better future for our state and are using the power of story to make it happen. Though these worthy projects amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars, these small offerings on my behalf pale in comparison to the centuries-long systems of oppression that have shaped the myths we carry with us as gospel. The myths we peddle and perpetuate that make it easier for us to believe that some people just have to be poor and others naturally deserve to be rich. The disembodied principles tied with the bootstraps of individualism that we put stock into so that we can rest easier at night, though others are stuck working themselves to an early grave. These stories we tell ourselves so we don't have to face the truth or ourselves in the mirror. Allow me to say just a bit more about stories, narrative, and how they indeed are all connected. A narrative is simply a collection or body of stories that feature characters joined in some common problem as heroes, villains, or victims in a particular setting and evolving plot. These stories come together to convey a common worldview or meaning and offer an interpretation of how the world works. For example, the movie Jaws is a story about a man-eating shark. All the stories about man-eating sharks then add up to a larger narrative of sharks being dangerous and predatory creatures. With this simple definition of how individual stories that are handed to us by various sources become the bread and butter of the narratives we believe in, it is easier to understand how changing harmful or antiquated stories begins to shift narratives that cause us and our loved ones harm too. The work I do in philanthropy requires that I work to assemble networks of people and organizations to change narratives on behalf of others like Derlin, the resilient old man I talked about earlier. But I must pause for a moment to reflect back on the revolutionary truth that I needed to hear myself, not as a professional in philanthropy, rather as a person who belongs to people who came before me. Being called resilient is not a compliment. For far too many, being resilient isn't a choice or a noble character trait. And most of all, calling resilience a noble attribute while also not calling out the conditions that led to that resilience makes you complicit in a narrative that causes irreparable harm. I came to this understanding, this new truth, because I finally decided to stop the old tapes singing the fairy tales of meritocracy that I'd been listening to my whole life and began to ask radical questions about the kind of future that I wanted to see. I came to this truth not because of the external narrative change work that I do in philanthropy, but because of the internal reconciling that forced me to tell the truth about the stories no one likes to tell, that do not have feel-good endings like Derlin's. Stories like that of my grandmother, who died at the age of 57 when I was just a preteen. For the longest time, because of the stories I'd been told making up false narratives of poor choices, I didn't understand the complex layers that contributed to her early death. But in correcting my limited view of the story of her life, I am now more clear than I've ever been. My grandmother worked herself to death with no material wealth to show for it. She was what was then called a domestic worker, cleaning white people's houses in Greenwood, Mississippi. She had little formal education, but was smart enough to create a family unit with her two sisters to keep my father and his siblings alive and well. She was in many ways a miracle worker, turning a loaf of bread and a little meat into feast to feed the whole neighborhood. She was woefully underpaid, yet exponentially resourceful. She represents the promise of an American dream of prosperity, yet it was a prosperity she would never get to see. While my grandmother was not alive during this modern COVID era, she existed in similar, maybe even worse conditions. A healthcare apartheid, meaning a forced lack of access to affordable and quality healthcare, coupled with the vestiges of Jim Crow segregation laws, ultimately allowed complications from diabetes to cause her untimely death. In addition to meager wages from the hands of stingy employers who had no value for Black life or labor, her story is a cautionary tale for all of us about the cost of uninterrogated resilience. Why do we believe in a system of economy that requires people to work themselves to death? What good is it to call these people resilient when systems of oppression only bless them with suffering and little to no tangible reward? My grandmother's story, and even Derlin's story, when heard by an uncritical ear, could easily lead one to simply believe that neither of them worked hard enough to achieve the American dream, without ever questioning if the dream was ever meant for them in the first place. This is why I want to spend the rest of our short time together talking about a newer, more expansive definition of resilience, one that is both evolutionary and revolutionary in its composition. As it stands, the current definition of resilience is one that will never be tough or elastic enough to outlast the oppression by which most resilience is born. There is no simple recovery from systemic racism and chronic poverty. There is no way that a soul can spring back into place after years of endless trauma and manufactured terror. The way that we understand resilience, divorced from the very real and present context of our daily reality, is not dynamic enough for the radical future all of us deserve. Following the prophetic words of Zora Neale Hurston, if you are silent about your pain, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it. I'd like to suggest that if you are honest about your truth, they will never be able to write your story for you. And the more we tell the stories that have either never been uttered or heard, the easier it will be for us to all participate in changing the narratives that keep us so stagnant. Think about the recent Olympic Games in Tokyo in comparison to the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta. How in 1996, Carrie Strug was forced to complete a second vault by her coaches, though she'd already injured her ankle on her first pass, simply because the US wanted to secure a win. And upon that perfect landing, she badly injured herself, securing the win for the team, but also solidifying her future without gymnastics due to the severity of her pain. Fast forward some 25 years later, we seem to have moved past the golden story of resilience for Carrie Strug's sacrifice and have made room for a more expansive view of resilience, meaning that though the world was shocked when US Olympian and gymnast Simone Biles pulled out of the all-around competition after an unsettling debut performance, she is by and large still being praised for the courage it took for her to insist that her health before the gold medal came first. The express and widely held respect for Simone Biles was made possible because somewhere along the way, people stopped praising athletes for hurting themselves just to secure the win, and began getting honest about the stories we all needed to hear. Stories of self-sacrifice to personal detriment, systemic silence covering up bad behavior in places of authority, and the rising numbers of burnout and breakdowns among athletes. In doing so, these raw stories became the bedrock for a new narrative of resilience to replace the old one, a narrative that includes our evolution as people to stop putting winning above wholeness. You see, that's what happens when we begin to tell the truth about our past. We make room for new networks of memory to form and shape a better way for the future. That's why there's no dollar figure or investment amount that will ever be too costly to aid in our evolution as humans who are all connected. It is why I will continue investing my time, talent, and treasure, both as a person and as a professional, in moving resources to whomever wants to tell underheard stories we so desperately need to hear, in the hopes that it will build new networks of people who will form a better future for all of us. I'll leave you with this. In 1970, poet and artist Gil Scott-Heron published his famous spoken word song, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." In it, he warns that the change that was coming, the revolution, would not be a function of the media, orchestrated by big corporations, or depend on people to tune in behind a screen. Instead, he says that the revolution will be live and in color, and it will require anyone who seeks it to become an active participant in it. I agree that the revolution will not be televised. The revolution is much too big to capture it all on film. Yet it is important to name that the revolution depends on our evolution as people, to be able to stand and tell the truth and shame the devil, as my grandmother would say. In that way, the revolution may not be televised, but it will be told. These stories of the revolution will be told for generations to come, and it is my sincere hope that we are resilient enough to tell it like it is, without romance or reduction or revision, only with our most radical futures in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that enlightening presentation. You've certainly given us a new perspective on the concept of resilience. I'm going to not start as I normally do with the tough, penetrating questions, but I'm going to pass the baton to my colleague, Helene Gale, who has been known to ask even tougher questions than I. Helene?
Well, I'm not going to ask tough questions, but you really have given us a lot to think about. And, you know, as I think about a lot of what you said, it reminds me of a saying that I have on my door in my office that says, until the lion learns to write, every story will glorify the hunter. And it really does, you know, to the point that you're making, speak about narrative and how important it is to have people speaking their own narrative. And just to give a little bit of context, you know, I had the Chicago Community Trust, the Community Foundation for Chicago, and we put closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap as our highest priority. And one of the areas really is focusing on resident voice and narrative and how important that is. So, you know, my question, and you touched on it, but just to say a bit more about how important it is to have people speaking from their own authentic voices, and you know, what difference does it make? And maybe you can even give some tangible examples. I can give one from how our local mainstream media portrayed an event, and then we had the community voice that totally portrayed it a different way. So just a bit more about the whole importance of narrative and narrative voice from the voice of the people whose voices are often disregarded.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. Narratives really shape who we are, what we believe, and how we govern ourselves. And oftentimes these narratives are deeply ingrained in our DNA, but these narratives have been built from what is called single stories. So to your point, world-renowned author Chimamanda
Right.
Ngozi Adichie
Exactly.
has a speech about the danger of a single story. And she talks about how the stories we often believe are incomplete because it's spoken and told from the vantage point of people in power. And they're telling a story that really doesn't belong to them. The story belongs with the people, particularly the people who it's happened to. And so a lot of times, in speaking of resilience, it's often a dangerous single-sided story because people in power are telling the stories. As you named, a lot of times the media will perpetrate those harmful narratives. And so getting community voice is absolutely necessary, particularly for people who are doing philanthropy or social change, because without community voice, without hearing from the people closest to the pain point, we are going to perpetuate or reinforce negative systems of oppression that have continued to keep people marginalized for centuries. And so in my daily work, we've really tried very hard to try doing what is called trust-based philanthropy, doing investments, having coalitions be built that are informed by the people on the ground doing the work, rather than us saying, these are the things that we want you to do and get done in the next year or however long the grant cycle is. And that's really been revolutionary for us to learn and listen to the stories from the people who are impacted most by inequities here in Arkansas.
Yeah, and I would just say, from my perspective, in the philanthropic world, so much has changed over time where this whole idea of participatory grant making and how we actually help to empower neighborhoods and communities is so important. But also, and maybe you could speak to this a little bit, philanthropy, it's a double-edged sword. We exist because of wealth that has been created by people who sometimes how they created their wealth, how they created, how they work with communities may or may not be in keeping with how we want to see the world. And so I would just be, and as you know, there's been lots of books written about philanthropy and the role it plays in a negative sense. So maybe for our audience, just say a bit about how you think philanthropy has both been part of things that have held communities back, but also what can philanthropy do in a way that can make a big difference, and how can it partner with other sectors to actually have a positive impact for communities?
Absolutely. Thank you for naming that dissonance that happens
Yeah.
when you a person working in philanthropy who wants to see a different future. You do have to reconcile with the truth that many times the foundation where you have worked has gained and amassed wealth on the backs of people of color, of enslaved African Americans brought over here in the diaspora, Native Americans, and the like. And so it's a weird feeling to be in philanthropy, figuring out how do you work with this money that was gotten sometimes in ill-gotten ways. But I think for me, the way that I reconcile doing the work is that similar to the age-old tale. I mean, we're talking about stories of Robin Hood. Robin Hood was he was taking from the haves to give to the have-nots, right? And philanthropy is not going to change unless people who have certain life experiences know how to see oppression for what it is, come to the table and try to redistribute those dollars that may have been amassed in unethical ways to be purposed for good. I don't think that we will ever get away from a system of capitalism in my lifetime. So that means I have to work within a system that I am entangled in that is oppressive and it's hard, and it means that there's going to be a lot of unfairness for a lot of people. But because I'm going to be a part of this system for at least the rest of my lifetime, I'm going to do what I can with it to get the dollars to the folks who need it the most. And so I think as it relates to, creating impact and, what philanthropy can continue doing to move forward and not regress, but progress, is to get more people of color in seats of power in philanthropy, to also cede power to people in the community. There's such things as advisory boards that the community should be sitting on that should help inform your grant making practices. We can do things like giving more unrestricted funds to organizations to be able to do what it is they need to do, pay a living wage, support and sustain their work, so that they're not burnt out and living with a crab in a barrel mentality. A lot of times the philanthropic sector is guilty of making it hard for folks to get their dollars and get money into the hands of their employees. And so we're really wanting to talk more about what does it look like for philanthropy to step up and make sure nonprofits are able to pay a living wage and have a life that they deserve to have while doing good in their communities. So those are some of the things that I would say that philanthropy needs to continue talking about to be held accountable to the type of social change that we need to see.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to hand it over to Errol to ask questions and close it out. But, we've all been living through this COVID moment. And when we talk about resilience and resiliency within communities, clearly COVID has been a real challenge in so many ways. It's amplified racial disparities, not only in health, but also in economics. Could you just say a little bit about how, where you are, how you're thinking about the COVID impact on the communities that you work with, and how does that really, kind of feature into this issue that we're talking about in terms of resiliency?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in my lecture, I talked a little bit about one of the focal areas that our foundation has taken up in our equity focus. It's the ALICE study, which has been done by several states, and it stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. And these are the people who they're making above the federal level, but they're still working far too hard to be struggling financially, working 2 and 3 jobs and can't even sustain their families. And so we've been having a lot of conversations here in Arkansas, at least, around, who ALICE is, who are these people who are, disproportionately impacted, particularly in this COVID moment, and what are the things that we can be doing to support them. We knew coming into COVID that regardless of the resilience that ALICE individuals have, they were going to be left out of the conversations about critical aid and support systems that they would need to continue maintaining our economy. And so a lot of what we have done is spent time trying to refunnel and filter infrastructure and systems of support to people who otherwise wouldn't have gotten it. So for example, we have an initiative called Delta Owned, where we have been able to support Black entrepreneurs in the Delta region of our state who wouldn't have otherwise gotten any PPP dollars, and their businesses would have closed down. We have really tried to steer away from thinking of short-term interventions as it relates to these populations, because we know that we have to start really addressing the root issue of why they are continually left out, routinely kept away from the type of thriving that they deserve. And so we really have looked at this COVID moment as, the ripping off of the Band-Aid so that we could see, just how stark the reality is for folks who are really maintaining our economy here in the state.
Thank you for that answer. Unfortunately, my colleague is going to have to leave to go to another meeting, but I did want Helene to interact with you based on her position at the Chicago Trust Foundation, and it's clear that you guys were talking shop and had a lot of shared interest. We have a number of questions that have come in over the question portal, one of which is very interesting. It says that you just mentioned that no cost is too great to set the narrative right. And they want to know whether that's code for reparations.
Oh, absolutely. I will be honest with you, this group, and if it gets me in trouble later, I'll take it on the nose. But I absolutely, I want my 40 acres and a mule, and I want everyone else to as well. And so I believe strongly that my role, that many people have also adopted this stance, is that we have to get the investments where they need to go, and the people who have been under-resourced, overlooked the absolute most. And so, yes, I look at it as a form of reparation, while it may not be as simple as, just granting people universal basic income or what have you. I'm trying to do what I can to build networks and coalitions that can support folks who need it most.
Okay, I think that's pretty clear to the questioner. Let me go back to another subject, because I was fascinated because you took a tact early on that questions whether our definition of resilience is something to be admired or not. And again, actually another question just came in that said, I find that strength and resilience are attributes often ascribed to Black women. How should we respond to that, where it's so often an attempt at a compliment? Should we accept it as a compliment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I really wrestled with that as I was putting my lecture together, because I do enjoy, being called strong or resilient every now and again. But I think context matters, right? If you're calling me strong and resilient because I can show up at work and be a workhorse in the midst of burnout, and I know that I'm not personally doing well, that means something different, right? So I think as relates to strength and resilience being assigned attributes,